Question 1. Cost-benefit analysis shows that launching Sika's new adhesive product in the UK market could significantly increase revenue within the first year. However, the product contains novel chemical compounds that may require specific environmental impact assessments and product safety certifications under UK regulations. What is the most appropriate course of action for Sika's compliance officer? Option A. Conduct a limited internal review of the product's safety data, assuming that if it meets general industry standards, it will comply with UK regulations. Option B. Rely on the product's existing certifications from other markets, assuming they will be sufficient for UK market entry without further investigation. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive review of all relevant UK environmental and product safety regulations. Engage with the Health and Safety Executive, HSE, and other relevant authorities to understand specific approval requirements, and ensure all necessary assessments and certifications are obtained before market launch. Option D. Proceed with the product launch immediately to capitalize on market demand, addressing any potential regulatory issues reactively if they arise. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the product launch immediately to capitalize on market demand, addressing any potential regulatory issues reactively if they arise. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires Sika's compliance officer to balance the potential financial benefits of a new product launch against the stringent regulatory requirements for product safety and environmental impact. The pressure to innovate and capture market share can create a conflict with the imperative to adhere to all applicable laws and guidelines, demanding careful judgment to avoid both regulatory breaches and reputational damage. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with the relevant regulatory bodies, such as the Health and Safety Executive, HSE, in the UK, to understand and comply with all pre-market approval processes and environmental impact assessments mandated by UK law and relevant EU directives that may still be applicable or have been retained in UK law post-Brexit. This demonstrates a commitment to responsible business practices and ensures that Sika's new product meets all safety and environmental standards before it reaches the market, thereby mitigating legal risks and safeguarding consumer and environmental well-being. This aligns with the principles of regulatory compliance and corporate social responsibility expected of companies operating within the UK. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed to market over thorough regulatory review would be ethically and legally unsound. This would involve launching the product without obtaining necessary certifications or conducting required environmental impact studies, potentially violating the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health (COSH) regulations or REACH registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals if applicable. Such an approach exposes Sika to significant fines, product recalls, and severe damage to its brand reputation. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that existing product approvals are sufficient without verifying their applicability to the new formulation or intended use. This oversight could lead to noncompliance with specific product standards or labeling requirements, resulting in penalties and market access issues. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape, early engagement with authorities, and a robust internal compliance process. This involves risk assessment, seeking expert legal and technical advice, and ensuring that all product development stages are aligned with legal and ethical obligations. Question 2. Regulatory review indicates that Sika's marketing department requires access to client project data to identify trends and inform future business strategies. However, the company operates under strict data protection regulations that govern the handling of client information. Which of the following approaches best ensures Sika's compliance and ethical data handling practices? Option A. Share aggregated client project data with the marketing department without specific anonymization, as long as it is not linked to individual client names. Option B. Share raw client project data directly with the marketing department, assuming internal use mitigates privacy risks. Option C. Obtain explicit written consent from each client before sharing their project data with the marketing department. Option D. Anonymize all client project data to remove any personally identifiable information before sharing it with the marketing department for analysis. The correct answer is D. Anonymize all client project data to remove any personally identifiable information before sharing it with the marketing department for analysis. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual at Sika to balance the company's operational needs with strict adherence to regulatory requirements concerning the handling of sensitive client information. Mismanagement of such data can lead to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all data handling practices are compliant and ethically sound. The correct approach involves implementing a robust data anonymization process before sharing any client information for market analysis, even internally. This aligns with the principles of data protection and privacy regulations, which mandate that personal data should be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security, including protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing and against accidental loss, destruction, or damage, using appropriate technical or organizational measures. Anonymization effectively removes the link between the data and the identifiable individual, thereby mitigating privacy risks and ensuring compliance. An incorrect approach would be to share raw client data directly with the marketing department without any form of anonymization or consent. This directly violates data protection principles by exposing personally identifiable information to unnecessary risk, potentially leading to breaches and noncompliance with regulatory frameworks governing data privacy. Another incorrect approach is to assume that internal sharing of data negates the need for anonymization. Regulations typically apply to the processing of personal data regardless of whether the recipient is internal or external. The risk of data misuse or accidental disclosure remains, and regulatory obligations persist. Finally, relying solely on verbal assurances from colleagues about data security without implementing documented and verifiable anonymization procedures is professionally unsound. It creates a dependency on individual actions rather than systemic controls, which is a common failure point in data governance and a direct contravention of best practices for regulatory compliance. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and data privacy. This involves understanding the specific data protection laws applicable to Sika's operations, conducting a thorough risk assessment for any data processing activity, implementing appropriate technical and organizational measures to mitigate identified risks, and ensuring ongoing training and awareness for all staff involved in data handling. When in doubt, seeking guidance from legal or compliance departments is crucial. Question 3. Consider a scenario where a client of Sika Financial Services expresses a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid alternative asset class that they recently read about. The client is insistent, stating they believe this is the next big thing and want to capitalize on it immediately. As a Sika Financial Services advisor, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Proceed with the client's requested investment immediately, as their instructions are paramount and Sika Financial Services must honor client directives. Option B. Politely decline the client's request, stating that Sika Financial Services does not offer such investments and that the client should seek advice elsewhere. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment to determine if the requested investment aligns with the client's financial situation, objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge. And if not, explain why and propose suitable alternatives. Option D. Advise the client to invest a small, experimental amount in the requested asset class to test the waters, without a full suitability assessment, to satisfy their immediate interest. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the client's requested investment immediately, as their instructions are paramount and Sika Financial Services must honor client directives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire for a specific product and the advisor's fiduciary duty to recommend suitable investments. The advisor must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure that recommendations are solely in the client's best interest, adhering strictly to regulatory requirements. Careful judgment is required to balance client satisfaction with regulatory compliance and ethical obligations. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough suitability assessment, considering the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge and experience. This aligns with the core principles of investor protection mandated by regulatory frameworks, which require financial professionals to act in the best interests of their clients. Specifically, Regulations often stipulate that recommendations must be suitable for the client, and this suitability must be documented. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's requested investment without a proper suitability assessment. This fails to uphold the advisor's duty of care and fiduciary responsibility, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and violating regulations that mandate suitability. Recommending an investment solely based on the client's stated preference without verifying its appropriateness is a direct contravention of investor protection rules. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without exploring the underlying reasons or offering suitable alternatives. While the client's request may not be suitable, a professional advisor should engage in a dialogue to understand the client's motivations and then guide them towards appropriate solutions. This approach risks alienating the client and failing to meet their underlying financial needs, even if the initial request was ill-advised. The professional decision-making process in such situation should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the client's request and the rationale behind it. 2. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment based on the client's profile. 3. If the requested investment is unsuitable, clearly explain the reasons to the client, referencing their profile and regulatory requirements. 4. Propose alternative investments that are suitable and align with the client's objectives. 5. Document all discussions, assessments, and recommendations thoroughly. Question 4. System analysis indicates that a Sika sales representative is in discussions with a potential major client. During these discussions, the client's procurement manager casually mentions that their company is currently evaluating several suppliers, and that a close relative of the procurement manager works for a direct competitor of Sika. The procurement manager then hints that a generous gesture could help expedite the evaluation process in Sika's favor. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Sika sales representative? Option A. Proceed with the sales discussions, subtly acknowledging the procurement manager's hint and exploring ways to offer additional value or incentives to the client that do not directly involve the relative. Option B. Immediately cease all discussions with the client and report the interaction to Sika's compliance department, seeking guidance on how to proceed ethically and legally. Option C. Continue with the sales discussions as planned, assuming the relative's employment is coincidental and the generous gesture is a standard business practice in that region. Option D. Discreetly investigate the procurement manager's relative's role at the competitor and the nature of the generous gesture before deciding on a course of action. The correct answer is B. Immediately cease all discussions with the client and report the interaction to Sika's compliance department, seeking guidance on how to proceed ethically and legally. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Sika to balance competing demands. The need to secure a new business opportunity with the imperative to adhere to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. The pressure to close a deal can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential ethical breaches. Careful judgment is required to ensure that Sika's reputation and legal standing are protected, even when faced with aggressive sales targets or competitive pressures. The core of the challenge lies in recognizing that short-term gains achieved through unethical means can lead to severe long-term consequences, including financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of trust from stakeholders. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent engagement with Sika's internal compliance framework and relevant regulatory guidelines. This means immediately raising concerns about the potential conflict of interest and seeking guidance from the appropriate internal departments, such as legal or compliance. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory adherence above immediate commercial gain. It demonstrates a commitment to Sika's values and a responsible approach to business operations. By involving the compliance function, the individual ensures that any decision made is informed by expert knowledge of Sika's policies and applicable laws, thereby mitigating risks and upholding the company's integrity. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the duty of care expected of employees. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the deal without disclosing the potential conflict of interest is professionally unacceptable. This failure constitutes a breach of ethical duty and potentially violates Sika's internal code of conduct and relevant anti-bribery and corruption regulations. It creates an undisclosed conflict of interest, which can lead to biased decision-making and unfair competitive practices. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the potential conflict and hope it goes unnoticed, is equally problematic. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a disregard for established compliance procedures. It exposes Sika to significant legal and reputational risks, as such conflicts, if discovered, can lead to severe penalties and damage to the company's brand. Furthermore, attempting to subtly influence the decision-making process of the potential client to favor Sika, even without direct bribery, can be construed as unethical and potentially illegal, depending on the specific nature of the influence and the jurisdiction's regulations on fair competition and commercial dealings. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of Sika's ethical guidelines and relevant legal frameworks. When faced with a situation that raises ethical or compliance concerns, the first step should always be to pause and assess the situation objectively. This involves identifying the potential risks and conflicts. The next step is to consult Sika's internal policies and procedures, particularly those related to conflicts of interest, anti-bribery, and ethical conduct. If there is any ambiguity or significant concern, escalating the issue to the appropriate internal authority, such as the compliance department or legal counsel, is paramount. This ensures that decisions are made with full awareness of the implications and in accordance with Sika's commitment to integrity and compliance. Question 5. The investigation demonstrates that a Sika procurement officer responsible for evaluating bids for a new raw material supplier has a close personal friendship with an individual working for one of the bidding companies. The officer is aware of this relationship and its potential to create a conflict of interest. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Sika procurement officer in this situation? Option A. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to their direct manager and the Sika compliance department, and recuse themselves from any further involvement in the evaluation process for that specific bid. Option B. Continue with the evaluation, but avoid any direct communication with the friend or their company during the process, hoping the relationship remains undetected. Option C. Discreetly favor the bid from the company where their friend is employed, ensuring the friend's company is presented favorably in the evaluation report. Option D. Proceed with the evaluation as planned, confident in their ability to remain objective and make a decision solely based on the merits of the bids. The correct answer is A. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to their direct manager and the Sika compliance department, and recuse themselves from any further involvement in the evaluation process for that specific bid. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Sika employee due to the potential conflict between a personal relationship and the company's ethical standards and procurement policies. Maintaining objectivity and avoiding even the appearance of impropriety is crucial in procurement to ensure fair competition and the best value for Sika. The employee must navigate this situation without compromising Sika's integrity or violating its internal guidelines. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately disclosing the relationship to the relevant manager or compliance department. This demonstrates transparency and adherence to Sika's code of conduct and procurement policies, which typically require disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. By proactively informing the company, the employee allows Sika to implement appropriate measures, such as reassigning the procurement decision or conducting enhanced oversight, thereby safeguarding Sika's interests and upholding ethical standards. This aligns with the principle of avoiding conflicts of interest and ensuring fair dealing. Incorrect approaches analysis. Failing to disclose the relationship and proceeding with the evaluation, even if the employee believes they can remain objective, is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This creates a hidden conflict of interest, potentially leading to biased decision-making, unfair treatment of other suppliers, and a breach of Sika's procurement integrity. It undermines trust and could expose Sika to reputational damage and financial disadvantage. Attempting to subtly influence the evaluation process in favor of the acquaintance, even without explicit instruction, is a direct violation of ethical principles and procurement policies. This constitutes favoritism and a breach of duty to act in Sika's best interest. Such actions can lead to the selection of a less suitable supplier, increased costs, and potential legal repercussions for both the employee and Sika. Ignoring the situation and hoping it goes unnoticed is also professionally unacceptable. This passive approach allows a potential conflict of interest to persist, increasing the risk of an actual breach of policy or ethical standards. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to uphold the responsibilities expected of an employee in a sensitive role. Professional reasoning. Professionals in procurement roles at Sika must adopt a proactive and transparent approach when faced with potential conflicts of interest. The decision-making process should involve identifying the potential conflict, understanding the relevant Sika policies and ethical guidelines, and then taking immediate, appropriate action to mitigate any risk. This typically means disclosure and seeking guidance from management or the compliance function to ensure all actions are aligned with Sika's commitment to integrity and fair business practices. Question 6. The analysis reveals that a potential client for Sika is eager to expedite the construction of a new facility in a region known for its sensitive ecological balance. The client has expressed a desire to bypass certain standard environmental impact assessment procedures to accelerate the project timeline. Considering Sika's commitment to sustainable development and regulatory compliance, which of the following approaches best aligns with professional and ethical obligations? Option A. Proceed with the project as requested by the client, prioritizing the expedited timeline and minimizing any perceived bureaucratic hurdles related to environmental assessments. Option B. Inform the client that Sika cannot undertake projects that deviate from standard environmental protocols without offering alternative solutions or further engagement on the assessment process. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment, engaging with local environmental agencies and community stakeholders to identify and mitigate potential risks, even if it means advising the client on a revised project timeline. Option D. Delegate the environmental assessment responsibility entirely to the client, assuming their internal processes are sufficient and compliant with local regulations. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the project as requested by the client, prioritizing the expedited timeline and minimizing any perceived bureaucratic hurdles related to environmental assessments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate financial desires and the long-term sustainability and ethical obligations of Sika's operations. A Sika employee must exercise careful judgment to balance these competing interests, ensuring compliance with all relevant regulations and upholding the company's reputation. The correct approach involves prioritizing a thorough and transparent assessment of the project's environmental impact, adhering strictly to the Sika Code of Conduct and any applicable local environmental regulations. This means conducting comprehensive site surveys, engaging with local communities and regulatory bodies, and developing mitigation strategies that genuinely address potential harm. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant, as it demonstrates Sika's commitment to responsible business practices and environmental stewardship, thereby safeguarding the company from potential fines, reputational damage, and legal challenges. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on expediting the project to meet the client's timeline without adequate environmental due diligence would be professionally unacceptable. This failure would violate ethical principles of corporate responsibility and potentially contravene environmental protection laws, leading to significant legal repercussions and severe damage to Sika's brand image. Another incorrect approach, which involves downplaying or omitting potential negative environmental impacts in reporting to the client or authorities, constitutes a serious breach of integrity and regulatory compliance. This deceptive practice not only risks legal penalties, but also erodes trust with stakeholders and undermines the principles of transparency and accountability that are fundamental to Sika's operations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of all applicable regulations and Sika's internal policies. This framework should then involve a systematic evaluation of potential risks and benefits associated with each course of action, prioritizing ethical considerations and long-term sustainability. Open communication with all relevant parties, including the client, internal management, and regulatory bodies, is crucial throughout the process. When faced with conflicting demands, professionals must advocate for the responsible and compliant path, even if it requires challenging the client's immediate preferences. Question 7. Operational review demonstrates Sika's strategic intent to rapidly expand its product offerings into a new international market. This expansion is driven by a desire to capture market share quickly. What is the most appropriate approach for Sika to ensure compliance with the new market's regulatory framework during this expansion? Option A. Delegate all regulatory compliance responsibilities to the newly established local Sika team with minimal oversight from headquarters. Option B. Focus on marketing and sales efforts, deferring detailed regulatory review until after initial sales have been generated. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the new market's specific regulatory requirements, product standards, and certification processes, and develop a detailed plan to ensure full compliance before product launch. Option D. Prioritize the speed of market entry by assuming regulatory requirements are similar to existing markets and addressing any compliance issues reactively. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the speed of market entry by assuming regulatory requirements are similar to existing markets and addressing any compliance issues reactively. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid growth and the imperative to maintain robust compliance with regulatory requirements. Sika, like any organization operating in a regulated industry, must balance its strategic objectives with its legal and ethical obligations. The challenge lies in ensuring that the pursuit of market expansion does not lead to shortcuts or oversights that could compromise product quality, safety, or adherence to established standards. Careful judgment is required to identify potential risks and implement appropriate controls. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive risk assessment process that integrates compliance considerations into the strategic planning for market entry. This means thoroughly evaluating the regulatory landscape of the new market, understanding local product standards, and ensuring that Sika's existing products and manufacturing processes can meet these requirements without significant deviation. It also necessitates engaging with local regulatory bodies and legal counsel to ensure full understanding and adherence. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and risk mitigation, thereby safeguarding Sika's reputation, avoiding potential fines or legal action, and ensuring the long-term sustainability of its operations in the new market. It aligns with the ethical duty to operate responsibly and legally. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the speed of market entry, without adequate due diligence on regulatory compliance, is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the legal framework governing Sika's operations, potentially exposing the company to significant penalties, product recalls, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that relies on assumptions about regulatory equivalence between markets without verification is also flawed. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and an overestimation of the company's existing knowledge, which can lead to unintentional noncompliance. Finally, an approach that delegates regulatory compliance entirely to local teams without establishing clear oversight and reporting mechanisms from headquarters risks creating inconsistencies and gaps in compliance across different regions. This undermines the principle of consistent corporate governance and responsibility. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory environment in any new market. This involves a structured risk assessment process, consultation with legal and compliance experts, and the development of clear action plans to address any identified compliance gaps before market entry. Continuous monitoring and periodic reviews are essential to ensure ongoing adherence to evolving regulations. Question 8. To address the challenge of a key client requesting access to Sika's internal financial projections for an upcoming project bid, which approach best upholds Sika's commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance? Option A. Politely decline the request, explaining that such proprietary information cannot be shared due to company policy and confidentiality agreements, while offering to provide publicly available or non-confidential data relevant to the project. Option B. Ignore the client's request and continue with the project discussion as if the request was never made. Option C. Provide the client with vague, non-specific estimates that hint at the projections without revealing actual figures. Option D. Agree to share the financial projections with the client to foster goodwill and secure the project, assuming the client will handle the information responsibly. The correct answer is A. Politely decline the request, explaining that such proprietary information cannot be shared due to company policy and confidentiality agreements, while offering to provide publicly available or non-confidential data relevant to the project. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Sika employee due to the potential conflict between a client's request and Sika's internal policies and ethical guidelines. The challenge lies in balancing client satisfaction with the imperative to uphold company standards and regulatory compliance, particularly concerning the disclosure of sensitive information. Misjudging this situation could lead to reputational damage for Sika, regulatory penalties, and a breach of trust with the client. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining the client's request to share proprietary financial projections. This is the right professional practice because it adheres to Sika's internal policies regarding confidential information and aligns with ethical principles of data privacy and fair competition. Sharing such projections would likely violate non-disclosure agreements, potentially compromise Sika's competitive advantage, and could be construed as insider trading if the information were to be used inappropriately by the client. The employee must communicate this refusal clearly and professionally, offering alternative, non-confidential information that can still assist the client. Incorrect approaches analysis. An incorrect approach would be to agree to the client's request and share the financial projections. This action would constitute a serious breach of Sika's confidentiality policies and potentially violate data protection regulations. It undermines the trust placed in Sika as a responsible custodian of sensitive business information and could expose the company to significant legal and financial repercussions. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the request and provide no response. This passive stance fails to address the client's needs or concerns, potentially damaging the client relationship and leaving the client with the impression that Sika is uncooperative or unprofessional. It also misses an opportunity to reinforce Sika's commitment to ethical business practices by explaining the boundaries of information sharing. A further incorrect approach would be to vaguely allude to the projections without providing specific figures, hoping to satisfy the client without revealing concrete data. This is problematic because it can create ambiguity and potentially lead to misunderstandings or misinterpretations by the client. It also skirts the ethical line of transparency and could still be perceived as an attempt to leverage confidential information indirectly. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Sika should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to company policy and ethical conduct. When faced with a request that may conflict with these principles, the process should involve 1. Identifying the core of the request and its potential implications. 2. Consulting relevant company policies and ethical guidelines. 3. Seeking clarification or guidance from a supervisor or legal department if uncertainty exists. 4. Communicating a clear, professional, and principled response to the requesting party, offering alternative solutions where appropriate. Question 9. The review process indicates that a prospective client has requested specific project details from Sika, including information that may be considered commercially sensitive and potentially identifiable to a third party. The sales team is eager to provide this information to secure the deal. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the Sika employee receiving this request? Option A. Immediately provide the requested project details to the prospective client to demonstrate Sika's transparency and responsiveness. Option B. Forward the request to a senior manager without any initial assessment or communication with the prospective client. Option C. Share the information with the prospective client after obtaining verbal confirmation from a colleague that it is likely permissible. Option D. Inform the prospective client that the information cannot be shared due to confidentiality agreements and data protection regulations, and offer to provide anonymized or aggregated data if available and permissible. The correct answer is A. Immediately provide the requested project details to the prospective client to demonstrate Sika's transparency and responsiveness. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Sika to balance the immediate need for information with the ethical and regulatory obligations concerning client confidentiality and data privacy. The pressure to provide a swift response, especially in a competitive business environment, can lead to shortcuts that compromise these principles. Careful judgment is required to navigate the potential conflict between business expediency and adherence to established standards. The correct approach involves a structured and compliant method of information gathering. This entails acknowledging the request, clearly stating the limitations imposed by confidentiality agreements and data protection regulations, and then initiating the appropriate internal process to seek consent or anonymization where possible. This approach upholds Sika's commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, safeguarding client trust and avoiding legal repercussions. It demonstrates a professional understanding that information access is governed by strict rules designed to protect individuals and businesses. An incorrect approach that immediately attempts to disclose the requested information without proper authorization or anonymization would represent a significant breach of client confidentiality and data privacy regulations. This failure stems from prioritizing expediency over legal and ethical duties. Such an action could expose Sika to legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. Another incorrect approach, such as outright refusal without explaining the reasons or offering alternative compliance solutions, might be perceived as uncooperative and could damage business relationships, although it avoids direct regulatory breach. However, a truly professionally unacceptable approach would be to fabricate or misrepresent information to satisfy the request, which is a direct ethical and potentially legal violation. Professionals at Sika should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes compliance and ethical conduct. This framework should include 1. Understanding the request and its implications. 2. Identifying relevant internal policies and external regulations, e.g., data protection laws. 3. Assessing the feasibility of fulfilling the request within these constraints. 4. Communicating transparently about limitations and seeking appropriate consent or alternative compliance solutions. 5. Documenting all actions taken. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are not only effective but also legally sound and ethically defensible. Question 10. What factors determine the appropriate level of due diligence when Sika is considering a new supplier that offers significant cost reductions but operates in a region with less stringent environmental regulations? Option A. The potential impact on Sika's brand reputation and the supplier's adherence to Sika's own sustainability and ethical sourcing policies. Option B. The immediate financial savings projected from the new supplier's pricing. Option C. The speed at which the contract can be finalized to meet internal sales targets. Option D. The supplier's stated commitment to environmental standards, regardless of local regulatory enforcement. Correct answer is A. The potential impact on Sika's brand reputation and the supplier's adherence to Sika's own sustainability and ethical sourcing policies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Sika employee because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term reputation and adherence to ethical business practices. The pressure to secure a large contract can lead to overlooking potential compliance issues, which could have severe consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all decisions align with Sika's commitment to integrity and regulatory standards. The correct approach involves a thorough due diligence process that prioritizes understanding and mitigating any potential risks associated with the new supplier, particularly concerning their compliance with relevant environmental and labor laws. This aligns with Sika's stated commitment to responsible business conduct and sustainability, as outlined in their corporate social responsibility guidelines. By conducting comprehensive checks, Sika demonstrates a proactive stance in preventing association with unethical or non-compliant entities, thereby safeguarding its brand reputation and avoiding potential legal repercussions. This approach reflects a commitment to ethical sourcing and supply chain management, which are increasingly important for global companies. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the cost savings offered by the new supplier, without adequate investigation into their compliance, fails to uphold Sika's ethical obligations. This could lead to indirect complicity in environmental damage or labor exploitation, damaging Sika's reputation and potentially incurring fines or sanctions. Another incorrect approach, which involves accepting the supplier's assurances at face value without independent verification, demonstrates a lack of professional skepticism and due diligence. This overlooks the possibility of misrepresentation and leaves Sika vulnerable to unforeseen risks. A third incorrect approach, which prioritizes speed to market over thorough vetting, neglects the fundamental principle of responsible business operations and could result in long-term damage that outweighs any short-term gains. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that integrates risk assessment with ethical considerations. This involves clearly defining the problem, gathering all relevant information, including regulatory requirements and company policies, identifying potential solutions, evaluating each solution against established criteria, including compliance, ethical impact, and business objectives, and then making a well-reasoned decision. Regular review and feedback loops are also crucial to ensure continuous improvement in decision-making processes. Question 11. The assessment process reveals that a candidate being considered for a role at Sika has a close personal friendship with the individual conducting a key part of the interview and evaluation. This individual is aware of the personal relationship. What is the most appropriate course of action for the individual aware of the relationship? Option A. Disclose the personal relationship to the hiring manager and HR, and recuse themselves from any involvement in the assessment or decision-making process for this candidate. Option B. Discreetly advocate for the candidate to the hiring manager, highlighting their strengths without explicitly mentioning the personal relationship. Option C. Inform the candidate that they will be interviewing them and suggest the candidate focus on their professional qualifications during the interview. Option D. Proceed with the interview and evaluation as normal, assuming their professional judgment will not be affected by the personal friendship. The correct answer is A. Disclose the personal relationship to the hiring manager and HR, and recuse themselves from any involvement in the assessment or decision-making process for this candidate. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate potential conflicts of interest and maintain the integrity of Sika's hiring process. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the desire to leverage existing relationships with the absolute necessity of adhering to fair and unbiased recruitment practices, as mandated by Sika's internal policies and relevant employment law. Careful judgment is required to ensure that personal connections do not unduly influence professional decisions, thereby upholding Sika's reputation and commitment to equal opportunity. The correct approach involves a transparent disclosure of the personal relationship to the hiring manager and HR department, followed by recusal from any decision-making process concerning the candidate. This upholds professional integrity by acknowledging the potential for bias and proactively mitigating it. This aligns with ethical principles of fairness and impartiality in recruitment, likely with Sika's internal code of conduct and any applicable employment regulations that prohibit discrimination and require objective assessment of candidates. By stepping aside, the individual ensures that the candidate is evaluated solely on their merits and qualifications, free from any perceived or actual favoritism. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the assessment and evaluation of the candidate without disclosing the personal relationship. This creates a significant conflict of interest and violates the principle of impartiality. It could lead to a perception of favoritism, undermining the fairness of the hiring process and potentially resulting in the selection of a less qualified candidate over a more suitable one. This failure to disclose and recuse could also contravene Sika's internal policies on conflicts of interest and potentially violate employment laws that mandate fair and non-discriminatory hiring practices. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to subtly influence the hiring manager or HR department in favor of the candidate, even without direct involvement in the formal assessment. This is a more insidious form of bias and is ethically reprehensible. It directly undermines the integrity of the recruitment process and could lead to legal repercussions for Sika if discovered. Such actions demonstrate a disregard for professional ethics and Sika's commitment to a merit-based selection process. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of Sika's internal policies regarding conflicts of interest and recruitment. When a potential conflict arises, the immediate step should be to identify the nature of the relationship and its potential to influence professional judgment. Transparency and disclosure to the appropriate parties, hiring manager, HR, are paramount. Subsequently, recusal from any part of the decision-making process that could be influenced by the relationship is the most ethical and professionally sound course of action. This ensures that Sika's hiring practices remain fair, objective, and legally compliant. Question 12. System analysis indicates that Sika is considering entering a new, emerging market with significant growth potential. However, preliminary intelligence suggests a complex and evolving regulatory environment with a history of inconsistent enforcement and potential for corruption. Which of the following approaches best addresses the inherent risks associated with this market entry from a regulatory and ethical perspective? Option A. Rely on informal information gathered from industry contacts and competitors operating in the region to gauge the level of regulatory and ethical risk, adjusting the strategy accordingly. Option B. Prioritize rapid market penetration to establish a first-mover advantage, deferring detailed regulatory and ethical risk assessments until after initial operations are established. Option C. Proceed with market entry based on the assumption that Sika's existing global compliance policies are sufficient and can be applied universally, focusing primarily on the commercial opportunity. Option D. Conduct a thorough, jurisdiction-specific risk assessment that includes detailed due diligence on local laws, anti-bribery and corruption regulations, and ethical business practices, integrating findings into the market entry strategy and developing tailored mitigation plans. Correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough, jurisdiction-specific risk assessment that includes detailed due diligence on local laws, anti-bribery and corruption regulations, and ethical business practices, integrating findings into the market entry strategy, and developing tailored mitigation plans. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Sika's risk management team due to the inherent conflict between the desire to expand market share and the imperative to maintain regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The pressure to achieve ambitious growth targets can sometimes lead to overlooking or downplaying potential risks, especially those that are less quantifiable or have long-term implications. Careful judgment is required to balance commercial objectives with the company's responsibility to operate within legal boundaries and uphold its reputation. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive risk assessment that integrates potential regulatory breaches and ethical lapses into the evaluation of new market entry strategies. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of good corporate governance and risk management, which mandate that all significant risks, including legal and ethical ones, must be identified, assessed, and mitigated. Specifically, it reflects the spirit of regulations that require due diligence, responsible business conduct, and adherence to anti-bribery and corruption laws, ensuring that Sika's expansion does not come at the cost of its integrity or legal standing. This method prioritizes long-term sustainability and stakeholder trust over short-term gains, an incorrect approach that focuses solely on the financial viability and market potential of a new region, without adequately considering the regulatory landscape and potential for ethical misconduct, is professionally unacceptable. This failure constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical lapse because it neglects the duty of care to identify and manage risks that could lead to substantial fines, reputational damage, and legal sanctions. Such an approach may inadvertently expose Sika to violations of anti-bribery laws, data protection regulations, or environmental standards, depending on the specific market. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of market entry over thorough due diligence, assuming that existing internal controls are sufficient without specific verification for the new jurisdiction, is also professionally flawed. This represents a failure to adapt risk management practices to the unique context of a new market, which may have different regulatory requirements and enforcement mechanisms. It can lead to overlooking critical compliance gaps and creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited, resulting in regulatory non-compliance and ethical breaches. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or the experiences of competitors in the new market to gauge risk, rather than conducting independent, data-driven assessments, is professionally unsound. This approach is susceptible to biases and incomplete information, failing to provide a robust basis for decision-making. It can lead to underestimation of specific risks relevant to Sika's operations and business model, potentially resulting in unforeseen legal and ethical challenges. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework that includes 1. Risk identification, systematically identifying all potential risks, including legal, regulatory, ethical, operational, and financial risks specific to the new market. 2. Risk analysis, evaluating the likelihood and impact of identified risks. 3. Risk evaluation, prioritizing risks based on their severity. 4. Risk treatment, developing and implementing strategies to mitigate, transfer, avoid, or accept risks. 5. Risk monitoring and review, continuously monitoring the effectiveness of risk treatments and updating the assessment as circumstances change. This process ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and ethically sound, safeguarding Sika's interests and reputation. Question 13. Compliance review shows that a new, potentially high-impact risk related to third-party due diligence has been identified during a routine operational check at Sika. The operational team is unsure of the exact regulatory implications, but believes it warrants immediate attention. What is the most appropriate next step for the operational team to take? Option A. Conduct an independent, in-depth investigation into the risk without involving other departments to ensure unbiased findings. Option B. Immediately implement a temporary broad restriction on all new third-party engagements until the risk is fully understood. Option C. Inform the immediate supervisor verbally about the risk and await their instructions on how to proceed. Option D. Document the identified risk, its potential implications, and escalate it through the established internal risk management channels for formal assessment and guidance. The correct answer is B. Immediately implement a temporary broad restriction on all new third-party engagements until the risk is fully understood. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires Sika to balance the need for efficient risk management with its obligations to maintain robust internal controls and adhere to regulatory expectations regarding the identification and mitigation of potential financial crime risks. The challenge lies in determining the most appropriate and compliant method for escalating a newly identified risk without causing undue disruption or overlooking critical compliance requirements. Careful judgment is needed to ensure that the chosen approach is both effective in addressing the risk and fully compliant with the Sika hiring assessment test's specified regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a structured escalation process that prioritizes thorough documentation and a clear rationale for the risk assessment. This method is right because it aligns with the principles of good governance and regulatory compliance, ensuring that identified risks are not only flagged, but also properly understood and addressed through appropriate channels. Specifically, it demonstrates a commitment to proactive risk management, a key expectation in regulated environments, by initiating a formal review process that allows for expert evaluation and the development of targeted mitigation strategies. This systematic approach minimizes the likelihood of overlooking critical compliance issues and ensures that Sika's internal controls remain effective. An incorrect approach that relies on informal communication or immediate, unverified action fails to meet regulatory standards. Informally communicating the risk bypasses established control frameworks, potentially leading to inconsistent application of policies and a lack of audit trail. This can be seen as a failure to implement adequate internal controls, which is a common regulatory concern. Immediately implementing a broad, unverified mitigation strategy without proper assessment risks overreacting, misallocating resources, and potentially creating new, unforeseen compliance issues. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to follow a structured, risk-based approach, which is essential for maintaining compliance and operational integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements applicable to Sika. This involves identifying the relevant internal policies and external regulations governing risk assessment and escalation. The next step is to assess the nature and potential impact of the identified risk, considering its severity and likelihood. Based on this assessment, professionals should then determine the most appropriate escalation path, which typically involves documenting the findings, the rationale for the assessment, and proposing a course of action. This structured process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with both business objectives and compliance obligations. Question 14. The performance metrics show a significant opportunity for Sika to expand its market share in a developing region, but initial due diligence has flagged potential concerns regarding local labor practices and environmental regulations that are less stringent than Sika's global standards. Which approach best addresses these concerns while pursuing the expansion? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that includes detailed analysis of local labor and environmental laws, potential ethical implications, and the development of mitigation strategies aligned with Sika's global standards, even if it delays immediate market entry. Option B. Proceed with market entry as planned, assuming that local practices will be adopted and that Sika's internal compliance mechanisms will be sufficient to manage any unforeseen issues. Option C. Focus primarily on the financial projections and potential revenue growth, deferring any in-depth investigation of labor and environmental concerns until after market establishment. Option D. Rely on the experiences of other multinational companies operating in the region to gauge the level of risk and adjust Sika's approach based on their reported successes and challenges. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment that includes detailed analysis of local labor and environmental laws, potential ethical implications, and the development of mitigation strategies aligned with Sika's global standards, even if it delays immediate market entry. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for Sika to achieve its strategic objectives with the imperative to conduct business ethically and in compliance with regulatory requirements. The pressure to meet performance targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential risks, especially those that are not immediately quantifiable or apparent. Careful judgment is required to ensure that short-term gains do not compromise long-term sustainability, reputation, or legal standing. The correct approach involves proactively identifying, assessing, and mitigating potential risks associated with Sika's expansion into a new market. This includes understanding the local regulatory landscape, potential ethical pitfalls, and the impact on stakeholders. By integrating risk assessment into the strategic planning process, Sika can make informed decisions that align with its values and regulatory obligations. This approach is justified by the fundamental principles of responsible business conduct and the regulatory expectation that companies operate with due diligence. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of good corporate governance, which mandate that companies manage their affairs in a way that protects their stakeholders and maintains their license to operate. An approach that prioritizes immediate market penetration without a thorough risk assessment fails to uphold the duty of care expected of Sika. This could lead to inadvertent breaches of local regulations, reputational damage, and potential financial penalties. Focusing solely on financial projections without considering the operational and ethical risks associated with a new market is a failure to conduct adequate due diligence. Another incorrect approach, which involves relying on anecdotal evidence or the experiences of other companies without specific due diligence for Sika's operation, ignores the unique context and potential risks of the new market. This demonstrates a lack of professional skepticism and a failure to adhere to best practices in risk management, which would likely be a violation of internal company policies and potentially regulatory guidance on risk oversight. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the objectives and then systematically identifying potential risks and opportunities. This should be followed by a thorough assessment of the likelihood and impact of each risk and the development of appropriate mitigation strategies. The process should involve consultation with relevant internal and external experts, and the outcomes should be clearly documented and communicated to senior management. Continuous monitoring and review of the risk landscape are also crucial. Question 15. Market research demonstrates that Sika's innovative construction materials are highly regarded. A Sika employee, who also holds a significant personal investment in a real estate development company that is currently evaluating various material suppliers for a major project, is tasked with providing a technical recommendation on the most suitable waterproofing solution. The employee genuinely believes Sika's product is superior for this application. What is the most ethically and professionally appropriate course of action for the Sika employee? Option A. Inform the client about the personal investment in the real estate development company and offer to recuse themselves from providing the recommendation if the client wishes, while still being available to answer general technical queries. Option B. Discreetly emphasize the benefits of Sika's product and subtly downplay the strengths of competing materials without explicitly disclosing the personal investment. Option C. Provide a detailed technical recommendation favoring Sika's product, highlighting its advantages, and proceed with the project without mentioning the personal investment, assuming the recommendation is technically sound. Option D. Decline to provide any specific product recommendation, citing a potential conflict of interest, and suggest the client seek advice from an independent consultant. The correct answer is C. Provide a detailed technical recommendation favoring Sika's product, highlighting its advantages, and proceed with the project without mentioning the personal investment, assuming the recommendation is technically sound. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Sika to navigate potential conflicts of interest and maintain the integrity of their professional advice. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the company's commercial interest with the duty to provide objective and unbiased recommendations to clients, particularly when those clients are considering Sika products. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for perceived or actual bias, which could undermine client trust and Sika's reputation. Correct approach involves proactively disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the client and offering to recuse oneself from the decision-making process if the client deems it appropriate. This approach is the most professionally sound because it prioritizes transparency and client autonomy. By disclosing the relationship, the Sika representative demonstrates ethical conduct and respects the client's right to make an informed decision, free from undue influence. This aligns with general principles of professional ethics that emphasize honesty, integrity, and putting the client's best interests first, even if it means potentially losing a sale in the short term. It also preempts any future accusations of impropriety. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the recommendation without any disclosure, assuming the Sika product is genuinely the best solution. This fails to acknowledge the inherent bias introduced by the personal investment and could lead to the client feeling misled if they later discover the conflict. This breaches ethical obligations of transparency and could damage the client relationship and Sika's reputation. Another incorrect approach would be to subtly steer the client towards Sika products without explicit disclosure, perhaps by highlighting only the advantages of Sika and downplaying alternatives. This is a form of deceptive practice, as it manipulates the client's decision-making process by withholding crucial information about the advisor's vested interest. It erodes trust and is ethically indefensible. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to avoid discussing any product options altogether, fearing a conflict. While seemingly cautious, this fails to fulfill the professional obligation to provide expert advice and assist the client in making an informed choice. It represents a missed opportunity to be helpful and could be perceived as uncooperative or lacking confidence in Sika's offerings, even if they are indeed suitable. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear framework. 1. Identify potential conflicts of interest. 2. Assess the materiality of the conflict and its potential impact on objectivity. 3. Prioritize transparency and disclosure to the client. 4. Offer options for managing the conflict, including recusal. 5. Document the discussion and decision. This process ensures that professional judgment remains paramount and that client interests are protected. Question 16. Strategic planning requires Sika to evaluate potential expansion into a new market. Before committing significant resources, what is the most prudent approach to ensure compliance with the relevant regulatory framework and uphold ethical standards? Option A. Rely on the company's existing compliance protocols, assuming they are universally applicable across different markets. Option B. Prioritize market opportunity and revenue projections, addressing regulatory concerns only if they become immediate obstacles. Option C. Conduct a thorough due diligence process that includes seeking expert legal and compliance advice specific to the target market's regulatory environment, integrating findings into the strategic plan. Option D. Delegate the entire responsibility for regulatory compliance to the local market team without central oversight. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough due diligence process that includes seeking expert legal and compliance advice specific to the target market's regulatory environment, integrating findings into the strategic plan. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Sika, as a global company, must navigate diverse regulatory landscapes while maintaining consistent ethical standards. The challenge lies in balancing the need for localized adaptation with overarching compliance and integrity. A decision-maker must consider not only the immediate financial implications, but also the long-term reputational and legal risks associated with noncompliance. The core of the challenge is to ensure that strategic decisions, particularly those involving new market entry or product development, are underpinned by a robust understanding of and adherence to the relevant regulatory framework, which in this exam's context is the UK regulatory framework and SISI guidelines. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough due diligence process that integrates regulatory compliance from the outset of strategic planning. This means actively seeking expert advice on the specific regulations governing Sika's operations in the target market, such as product safety standards, environmental regulations, and marketing practices, all within the UK context. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of good corporate governance and regulatory adherence, as emphasized by SISI guidelines which promote integrity and professionalism. By embedding compliance into the strategic framework, Sika mitigates legal risks, avoids potential fines, and builds trust with stakeholders, thereby safeguarding its reputation and long-term sustainability. This aligns with the UK's emphasis on robust regulatory oversight and the SISI commitment to upholding professional standards. An incorrect approach would be to assume that existing compliance measures in one market are sufficient for another, or to prioritize speed to market over regulatory scrutiny. This is a failure because it demonstrates a disregard for the specific legal and regulatory requirements of the new jurisdiction, which could lead to significant penalties, product recalls, and reputational damage. Such an approach violates the principle of due diligence and could be seen as negligent under UK corporate law and SISI ethical codes, which mandate a thorough understanding of applicable rules. Another incorrect approach would be to delegate the entire responsibility for regulatory compliance to local teams without adequate oversight or integration into the central strategic planning process. While local expertise is crucial, ultimate accountability for compliance rests with the company's leadership. This failure stems from a lack of centralized control and a potential disconnect between strategic objectives and operational compliance, risking inconsistent application of standards and overlooking critical regulatory nuances. This is contrary to the proactive and integrated approach advocated by both UK regulations and SISI guidelines. A third incorrect approach involves making strategic decisions based solely on market opportunity, without a comprehensive assessment of the regulatory environment. This is flawed because it prioritizes potential profit over legal and ethical obligations. Such a myopic view can lead to unforeseen obstacles, costly remediation efforts, and severe legal repercussions, undermining the very market opportunity Sika sought to exploit. It demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to integrate risk management into strategic planning, which is a cornerstone of responsible business practice under UK law and SISI standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant regulatory jurisdictions. For each jurisdiction, they must then conduct a comprehensive risk assessment, seeking expert legal and compliance advice. This assessment should inform the strategic options, ensuring that any chosen path is not only commercially viable, but also fully compliant and ethically sound. Continuous monitoring and adaptation to evolving regulatory landscapes are also critical components of this framework. Question 17. The performance metrics show a slight dip in the quality control pass rate for a specific batch of Sika products manufactured in the last quarter. While the current pass rate still falls within the acceptable range set by internal guidelines, a junior quality assurance officer has flagged a pattern of minor aesthetic imperfections that, while not affecting functionality, are becoming more frequent. The officer is concerned that these imperfections, if left unaddressed, could lead to increased customer complaints and damage Sika's reputation for premium quality. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Sika management team to take? Option A. Instruct the quality assurance team to focus on meeting the established pass rate targets and to only escalate issues that result in formal customer complaints or significant functional failures. Option B. Initiate an immediate, in-depth investigation into the root cause of the aesthetic imperfections, review the production process for that batch, and implement corrective actions to prevent recurrence, even if it temporarily impacts production output or requires additional resources. Option C. Immediately assign blame to the production line supervisor responsible for that batch and demand an explanation for the perceived lapse in quality control. Option D. Acknowledge the quality officer's concern, but decide to monitor the situation closely without immediate intervention, as the pass rate is still within acceptable internal limits and the imperfections do not affect product functionality. The correct answer is B. Initiate an immediate, in-depth investigation into the root cause of the aesthetic imperfections, review the production process for that batch, and implement corrective actions to prevent recurrence, even if it temporarily impacts production output or requires additional resources. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential issues. Careful judgment is required to ensure that short-term gains do not compromise Sika's integrity, reputation, or legal standing. The correct approach involves proactively addressing the identified quality concerns by initiating a thorough investigation and implementing corrective actions, even if it means a temporary impact on performance metrics. This aligns with Sika's commitment to product quality and customer satisfaction, which are foundational to its brand reputation and sustainable business practices. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to transparency and responsible conduct. From a regulatory perspective, failing to address known product defects could lead to breaches of consumer protection laws and product safety regulations, resulting in significant penalties and reputational damage. An incorrect approach of downplaying the quality issues to avoid immediate negative impacts on performance metrics is ethically unsound. It prioritizes superficial results over genuine product integrity and customer well-being. This could be seen as misleading stakeholders and potentially violating regulations related to product quality and disclosure. Another incorrect approach of delaying action until a formal complaint is received is also professionally unacceptable. It demonstrates a reactive rather than proactive stance on quality control and risk management. Waiting for a complaint means that customers may have already received substandard products, leading to dissatisfaction and potential harm, and it also increases the likelihood of regulatory scrutiny and legal repercussions. A further incorrect approach of blaming the production team without a thorough investigation is unfair and unprofessional. It bypasses the necessary due diligence to identify the root cause of the quality issues. This can damage internal morale and trust, and it fails to address the systemic factors that may be contributing to the problem, thus not preventing future occurrences. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Recognizing and acknowledging potential issues, regardless of their immediate impact on metrics. 2. Conducting thorough investigations to understand the root cause of problems. 3. Implementing appropriate corrective and preventative actions. 4. Communicating transparently with relevant stakeholders. 5. Continuously monitoring and evaluating processes to ensure ongoing quality and compliance. Question 18. The evaluation methodology shows that a Sika sales representative has been offered an all-expenses-paid weekend trip to a major sporting event by a key supplier who is currently in the process of bidding for a significant contract with Sika. The sales representative is aware that the supplier's bid is competitive but not definitively the best. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Sika sales representative to take? Option A. Accept the offer and use the experience to build a stronger relationship with the supplier, which could benefit future Sika business. Option B. Accept the offer, as it is a gesture from a valued supplier and the representative believes they can remain objective in their evaluation. Option C. Accept the offer but inform Sika's compliance department after the event, explaining it was a gesture of goodwill. Option D. Politely decline the offer, citing company policy on gifts and entertainment, and continue to evaluate the supplier's bid objectively. Correct answer is D. Politely decline the offer, citing company policy on gifts and entertainment, and continue to evaluate the supplier's bid objectively. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Sika to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with internal policies and external regulations regarding the acceptance of gifts and entertainment. The core of the challenge lies in distinguishing between acceptable business courtesies and inducements that could compromise professional judgment or create an appearance of impropriety. Careful judgment is required to uphold Sika's reputation and maintain ethical business practices. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and application of Sika's internal gift and entertainment policy, which is designed to align with relevant regulatory frameworks. This approach prioritizes transparency, adherence to predefined limits, and seeking appropriate internal approval when necessary. Specifically, it involves assessing the nature, value, and context of the proposed gift or entertainment against the policy's guidelines. If the gift or entertainment falls within acceptable parameters and does not create a conflict of interest, it can be accepted. If it exceeds these parameters or raises concerns, it must be declined or reported for further review. This aligns with ethical principles of integrity and avoiding undue influence, and is likely mandated by Sika's compliance program, which itself must adhere to general principles of corporate governance and anti-bribery legislation applicable to Sika's operations. An incorrect approach would be to accept the offer without considering Sika's policy or the potential implications. This could lead to a violation of internal compliance procedures, potentially creating a perception of favoritism or bribery, which could have serious reputational and legal consequences for both the individual and Sika. Another incorrect approach would be to accept the offer because it is from a long-standing client, without scrutinizing its value or nature against the policy. Client relationships are important, but they do not supersede ethical obligations and compliance requirements. A further incorrect approach would be to accept the offer and then attempt to conceal it from Sika's compliance department. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a deliberate attempt to circumvent established controls, which is a serious ethical and regulatory breach. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of company policies and relevant regulations. When faced with a situation involving gifts or entertainment, they should ask, does this offer align with Sika's gift and entertainment policy? Could accepting this offer create a conflict of interest or the appearance of one? Would I be comfortable if this offer and my acceptance were publicly known? If there is any doubt, the professional should err on the side of caution, seek guidance from their manager or compliance department, and prioritize ethical conduct and regulatory adherence above all else. Question 19. Compliance review shows that Sika's marketing department is proposing a new campaign for a recently launched adhesive product that highlights its superior bonding strength compared to a leading competitor's product. The proposed campaign includes statements such as outperforms all others and the strongest bond available. The internal compliance team has flagged these claims as potentially problematic under the relevant regulatory framework for advertising construction materials. Considering the potential for regulatory scrutiny, which of the following approaches best aligns with Sika's compliance obligations? Option A. Focus the campaign solely on the product's features and benefits without making any direct or indirect comparisons to competitors, to entirely avoid any potential regulatory ambiguity. Option B. Adopt the competitor's marketing language and claims, as this indicates a generally accepted industry standard for such product comparisons. Option C. Modify the campaign to include specific, independently verifiable data and expert endorsements that substantiate the comparative claims, and seek pre-approval from the compliance department before launch. Option D. Proceed with the campaign as proposed, assuming that the claims are sufficiently vague to avoid regulatory action, and address any potential issues if they arise. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the campaign as proposed, assuming that the claims are sufficiently vague to avoid regulatory action, and address any potential issues if they arise. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Sika's internal compliance team has identified a potential conflict between a new marketing campaign and existing regulatory guidance. The challenge lies in interpreting the nuances of the guidance and applying it to a novel marketing strategy, ensuring both commercial effectiveness and strict adherence to regulations. Careful judgment is required to balance these competing interests without compromising Sika's integrity or legal standing. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the specific regulatory framework governing marketing claims for construction materials in the relevant jurisdiction. This entails understanding the definitions of comparative advertising, misleading claims, and substantiation requirements as defined by the applicable laws and industry codes. The correct approach would then involve consulting with Sika's legal and compliance departments to interpret these regulations in the context of the proposed campaign. This ensures that any claims made are factually accurate, demonstrably substantiated, and do not mislead consumers or unfairly disadvantage competitors, thereby aligning with the principles of fair competition and consumer protection mandated by the regulatory framework. An incorrect approach that relies solely on competitor marketing practices fails to meet regulatory standards. Competitor actions, even if widespread, do not establish a legal or ethical precedent for Sika. If competitors are making unsubstantiated or misleading claims, Sika's adherence to the same practices would constitute a regulatory violation and an ethical breach. Another incorrect approach, which is to proceed with the campaign based on the assumption that if it's not explicitly forbidden, it's allowed, demonstrates a dangerous misunderstanding of regulatory compliance. Regulatory frameworks often operate on principles of general prohibition against misleading or unfair practices, rather than exhaustive lists of prohibited actions. This approach risks making claims that, while not specifically enumerated as forbidden, are nonetheless contrary to the spirit and intent of the law. A third incorrect approach, which is to prioritize the marketing team's immediate objectives over regulatory scrutiny, represents a significant failure in professional judgment and ethical conduct. While commercial success is important, it must be achieved within the bounds of the law and ethical standards. Ignoring or downplaying compliance concerns to meet short-term marketing goals can lead to severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of consumer trust for Sika. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory landscape. This involves proactive engagement with compliance and legal teams, seeking clarification on ambiguous guidance, and conducting a risk assessment of any proposed marketing activities. The framework should prioritize adherence to the letter and spirit of the law, ensuring that all claims are accurate, substantiated, and fair, even if it requires modifying commercial strategies. Question 20. Quality control measures reveal a potential security vulnerability in the way sensitive client project data is being stored on a shared internal drive at Sika. The data includes confidential financial details. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the Sika employee who discovers this? Option A. Forward the data directly to the client to inform them of the potential issue. Option B. Securely transfer the project data to the Sika IT security team for analysis and remediation. Option C. Attempt to fix the security vulnerability independently by modifying the drive's permissions. Option D. Share the data with a trusted colleague on the project team to get their opinion on the vulnerability. The correct answer is B. Securely transfer the project data to the Sika IT security team for analysis and remediation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Sika employees regarding the appropriate handling of sensitive client information. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for internal collaboration and efficiency with the stringent regulatory requirements for data privacy and confidentiality. Mismanagement of this information can lead to significant reputational damage, regulatory penalties, and loss of client trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions align with Sika's internal policies and relevant data protection laws. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves securely transferring the project data to the designated Sika IT security team for analysis and remediation. This is the best professional practice because it adheres to established protocols for handling potential data breaches or security vulnerabilities. It ensures that the sensitive information is managed by trained professionals who can assess the risk, implement appropriate security measures, and comply with regulatory obligations, such as data breach notification requirements if applicable. This method prioritizes data integrity and client confidentiality, aligning with ethical responsibilities and legal frameworks governing data protection. Incorrect approaches analysis. Sharing the data directly with a colleague outside of the IT security team, even if they are involved in the project, represents a regulatory and ethical failure. This bypasses established security protocols, increasing the risk of unauthorized access or accidental disclosure. It violates the principle of least privilege and could contravene data protection regulations by exposing sensitive information to individuals who do not have a legitimate business need or the necessary security clearance to handle it. Attempting to resolve the security issue independently without involving the IT security team is also a significant failure. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of Sika's security infrastructure and the potential severity of the vulnerability. It could lead to further compromise of the data or the system, and it prevents the organization from fulfilling its regulatory duty to respond promptly and effectively to security incidents. Forwarding the data to the client directly to inform them of the potential issue before Sika has conducted a thorough internal investigation is a premature and risky action. While transparency is important, doing so without a clear understanding of the breach's scope and impact could cause unnecessary alarm, damage Sika's reputation, and potentially violate notification requirements by not following the prescribed regulatory channels. It also relinquishes control over the communication regarding a security incident. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Sika should follow a structured decision-making process when encountering potential data security issues. This process begins with recognizing the sensitivity of the information and the potential regulatory implications. The next step is to consult Sika's internal policies and procedures regarding data security and incident response. If a potential issue is identified, the immediate and correct action is to escalate it to the designated internal expert team. In this case, the IT security department. This ensures that the situation is handled by those with the appropriate expertise and authority, minimizing risk and ensuring compliance with all relevant laws and ethical standards. Documenting the incident and the steps taken is also crucial for accountability and future reference.